brief overview, our Citizen Advocate Academy this year is going to look a little bit different. Part of that is because of COVID, and part of that is also because the legislative session is looking a lot different this year. As many of you know, session has been kind of in and out all summer, and it's changed some of the dynamics we have with lawmakers. But if anything, those changes are making it more important now than ever that you are telling them about your experiences and what you want to see in Minnesota politics. So even though we can't physically go to the Capitol the same way that we're used to, there are tons of ways in which you can use your story and in which your voice can have an even more powerful impact because of how critical a time that we're living in is right now. So to dive in, kind of the first question we like to ask is, who is the expert on your life? This is a little rhetorical, but I also would love to hear. Rebecca's pointing to herself. Yes, you are, right? Some people think that, and less you guys, but there's like this thought that only doctors and professionals can talk about things in policy. And that is simply not true. The person who has the best knowledge about how policy affects you is you, right? You know what you've been through, you know what you've experienced, and that is such a powerful tool. So one of the things that we're working on is centering your story in how policies are created, shaped, debated, etc. And one of the best things we can do is get those stories to the politicians who are making decisions. So you can see the little guy on I believe that is page 6, if you're following along in your binder, is saying me, I'm the expert in my story. And that's a really great way to think about this. You don't need any credentials to tell your story. So moving along to page 7, we have to ask ourselves, what is advocacy? A lot of times advocacy can get a little confusing because there are different types of advocacy. So a lot of times you talk about patient advocacy and you hear, patient advocates as a term. And sometimes people think that means that they're doing legislative work. And that's not always the case. Advocacy exists outside of politics and what we're doing at the Capitol, and can just be personal. So if you are a personal advocate, you can stand up to your doctor to say, no, I am experiencing these symptoms and I need you to believe me. You can advocate for better treatment. You can advocate for the things that you need. You can advocate for the things that you deserve. And so that individual focus makes it personal advocacy. And we're not talking about that so much as we're talking about the second, which is political advocacy. And that's more focused on systems. So in some ways, you are still standing up for yourself, but you're standing up for yourself in a way that changes systems so that other people in similar situations like you don't go through the same thing. So a good example of political, with the personal example, it was, you standing up to your doctor. Political, it could be, I fell through a gap in Medicaid, and that's unacceptable. We need to close that gap. And so you go to your lawmakers and you say, hey, I have an issue that I see. How can we fix it so that somebody like me doesn't go through this again? And so you're working to change things for more than just yourself. You're working for change for larger communities. Sometimes it's just people with brain injury, other people with brain injury. Sometimes it's for the disability community. And sometimes it's for every single Minnesotan. So a great example of that was Mitchell's Law, which we worked on last year. What communities were impacted by Mitchell's Law? Can anybody tell me?
Every single one.
Every single one?
Every single one.
Yeah. So while it started as an experience of someone with a brain injury, it changed systems for people so much broader than that, right? My mom can go to the DMV and have her emergency contacts put on, even though she has no connection to brain injury, right? That's a really cool thing. So you're changing systems and advocating for Minnesota to serve everyone better.
Molly, I didn't know that. I thought it was just the brain injury community and the disability community that could do that. But
yeah, it's everyone.
That's news to me. Thank you.
Yeah. Another really important distinction to make, and this is on page 8 in your binder, is the distinction between direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying. And you guys maybe have a little bit of an advantage because you work with Zach and I so much. And really in our roles, we kind of focus on one or the other. So Zach focuses on our direct lobbying strategy and I focus on our grassroots lobbying strategy. But it's sometimes hard to parse out what is what. And sometimes there's some overlap, which can make it hard to understand. But direct lobbying is basically the face-to-face contact between paid staff and policymakers. So when Jeff and Zach and I go to the Capitol every day and talk to lawmakers, that's direct lobbying, right? If you were to go to the Capitol and talk to legislators, that would not be a direct lobby, or would not be direct lobbying unless you were staff and paid for it. Does that make sense? So you are not a lobbyist in the direct sense just because you go. Because there's a second, in my opinion, even better way to get involved, which is grassroots lobbying. And that's what you guys do. And, you know, as much as, you know, I call myself a grassroots lobbyist, I really am a direct lobbyist who just helps grassroots lobbyists. You guys are the grassroots. So that's working with other people, having them contact their elected officials, you know, doing all of the work that you see us doing every day, getting you to the Capitol and getting you to share your story. And so that grassroots work really comes because, and the little picture is going to show up, it comes from the bottom up. So if you think about like the way in which decisions are made, you have like the leadership at the top of the legislature, and then you have the two bodies with, you know, like 201 people, and then you have all the citizens who they represent. Well, who are you? You're the bottom, you're the grass. But grass grows and it grows upwards. And so that's where that word comes from, which I think is a cool way to think about it. So you guys are from the bottom up talking about change to those who are higher up. And eventually it kind of trickles up and the decisions get made.
You know, Mom, you mentioned the Capitol.
Yeah.
And is there any news out there about opening up with with more space between people, I suppose?
Yeah, so right now, they are allowing like legislators and staff at the Capitol within some social distance guidelines, but we really have not heard much about it opening for the public. With how busy the Capitol is and how many people are there, I think that we will likely be waiting a while until they open back up. Yeah, which is, you know, that's sad. And, you know, it's not fun to have that route of expressing yourself and of sharing your opinion cut off, but one of the cool things we're going to talk about at the end of this session is how do you share your story with COVID? How do we keep being active even in the midst of COVID? So how do we make sure that you guys stay safe, your lawmakers stay safe, but they still hear your story? Because I think some people have just said, well, I can't go. Oh, well. And that's not what we need to do. We need to say, oh, I can't go. Here's what I do instead. And so we're going to redirect that a little bit. So at the very bottom of that slide is, you know, a phrase that I think you guys have heard a million bajillion times, which is personal stories are our most effective strategy. Personal stories are our most important strategy. I will say this 100,000 times because it's true. Because the way that we make change is by having you sit in front or call or email your lawmakers and have them hear directly from you about your experiences. And that's so much more powerful than Jeff or Zach or I walking into a room with a lawmaker and having a quick chat. You know, there's a space for that. There's a role for that, direct lobbying. But the grassroots lobbying really builds it up from the bottom, which is what we're looking to do. So I think all of you have seen these little green sheets before. And so we're moving on to page 9 in your binder. But our how to tell your story module has not changed all that much over the past couple of years. And the reason is because it works. Having your storyboard is a really good way for you to think about your story and for you to organize it in a way that will help you be a more effective advocate. I know one of the things, you know, I was leading a training on how to tell your story with some of Amy's folks online, and we were talking about like how word vomiting happens sometimes when you have a brain injury. You end up with tangents here, tangents there. You can talk for hours and you never get to the point. Well, the reason we have these storyboards is so that you know going in what you need to say and what your point is. And so it helps keep you concise. It helps keep you really clean. And most importantly, it means that you're ready whenever an opportunity arises. So these storyboards help you frame your story around a specific problem and solutions. And we'll talk a little bit more about later about how you should have a different storyboard for each of the problems that you're working on and each of the solutions that you're promoting. It also helps create an effective political message that leads to positive change. So that's really where I get into like, are you talking or are you talking with a purpose? So what's the point of what you're saying? What is the conclusion that you're trying to help your audience reach? And your audience is obviously the lawmakers in this situation. And probably most importantly, it helps you stay focused and brief, right? If you had these storyboards in the past, you know they're about this big. If you got your binder this year, we have them full size, but that doesn't mean you get to add more. Sorry to tell you that. And so they really help you organize your thoughts in a way that is going to make sure that you are successful, which is a really cool thing to do because sometimes there's not a lot of structure in legislative meetings, and so this gives you that structure. You can also use your story in a lot of different ways, which is awesome. So your story helps make sure, or so having your storyboard ready at least helps make sure that you know you can step up to the challenge. Like for instance, you know, Patsy helped out at a rally for This Is Medicaid last year, and at the very end, one of the reporters was like, "Can I do an interview with you?" And because Patsy had her story ready, she could say yes and was prepared to answer those questions and to tell her story in that format. Well, what if you hadn't prepared anything, right? That would have been much more stressful and much more difficult. Or, you know, I know Rebecca, and I'm not sure if we have anyone else here who's testified on super, super short notice, but every once in a while we'll have like 2 days notice to testify at a hearing. Right? And you don't want to be cramming the past 2 days to write a whole new story. So if we do it now and we have it ready, when there's an opportunity, you can say yes, and you can jump in and make sure that your voice is heard and not have as much stress or worry about it, which is really nice. So I list a couple of things in there about how you can use your story, some of which I mentioned, the in-person meeting, so that's obviously less common. You can send an email with the text, you can have a phone call, you could post it on your Facebook or your social media, you can put it on YouTube. We have a series where, you know, Jeff filmed a couple folks sharing their story and we have them on YouTube, and that's a really great way for new folks to see what it's like to share your story. Newspapers, TV, there are so many ways in which your story can be used. So don't think that it's just about, you know, when I go to the Capitol or when I'm talking to lawmakers. It's really much broader than that. You can kind of use it in whatever situation pops up. So let's dive in. This is kind of the fun part where we talk about each steps of the story. And so we have it broken down into 3 main parts. The first is the intro. The second is the problem, and the third is the solution. So, and how numbers work, we're going to start with number 1 and start with the introduction. And this is kind of the fun one. I like this one. What is the most important part of your introduction?
Your name.
Your name, yeah.
And where you live.
Where you live. Anything else? My 6th grade teacher used to call it your attention getter. So you want to get their attention. So, you know, one of the things we call this is like your 60-second personal commercial, right? This is you saying what your name is, so who you are, where you live, and why do they care about where you live? It's a little bit of a cheat because it's on the board, but because they want to know that you're a constituent. Yep. That's so important. That is so important. Because when you're a constituent, you have the power to elect them or to choose to not elect them again, right? So in some ways, when you're a constituent, you hold a lot of power over them. You're part of their voting base. And so sometimes, you know, you'll have meetings with lawmakers and they'll be like kind of apathetic, and then you'll say you're a constituent. You can like see their ears perk up. They're like, oh no, like I need them to like me. I need them to work with me. And it's not a 100% guarantee, but you saying you're a constituent automatically will get you a little bit of credibility and will make it a little bit more likely that they'll listen and really engage with what you're having to say. It also is nice when you're trying to schedule meetings because they will often give priority to constituents when you're trying to get a meeting. And that's true whether it's over the phone, over email, or in person. And you really need to catch their attention in that first 60 seconds, which is hard to do.
That's why I used Coffee John.
Yep.
That's why I used my
Yeah.
nickname.
Yeah, exactly. Then you're memorable. There's something, really
Right. A
memorable
cachet.
about you. Yeah. Another really good way to catch their attention is to tell them about your brain injury.
Yep.
How did you receive it? Because a lot of times those stories, they're emotional. They're vulnerable, and that, if you're comfortable sharing how you got your brain injury, that's a great way to make sure that they're like engaged with you and that you have their attention.
Yep.
And finally, just be authentic. This is you talking to another human being, right? So this isn't like an essay in college or high school where you have to like sound professional all the time. You can use, you can speak the way that you would normally speak. You can use humor if you want to. You don't have to. And really feel free to express yourself in like the way that you normally do. So once we have the introduction, then we move on to step number 2, which is the problem. And so for folks following along on your binders, this is on page 11. And the problem, this is one place where advocates can get really stuck. And one of the things that's really important is to think about a systems problem rather than necessarily a personal problem. And let me explain. So oftentimes, we think of problems in our life. There are little things. I don't like my brother. He drives me insane, right? And then there are bigger things that are like, I cannot access the health care that I need, or I have the hardest time getting Metro Mobility to pick me up and not have it take like 4 hours to get where I want, right? Those are more systems-based problems. And sometimes that's hard to parse. That's one of the reasons Zach, Jeff, and I are here to help. So if you are like not sure whether it's like just a personal problem or a systems problem, we would love to have those conversations with you. And sometimes even personal problems can, if you think about it a different way, can be actually a systems problem. The really, really, really hard part about this is that you only get to pick one. And that's so hard. That is so difficult to do, because we know that with brain injury, there are all of these systems that are all intersecting in really weird ways and wonky ways. And every brain injury looks different. So everybody's services need to be different. And that makes it means that there are a lot of problems that exist. We talk all the time about transportation, housing, we talk about healthcare, we talk about prevention, and all of these things are all interconnected, right? And all of you experience them in slightly different ways. But one of the things that's really important is when you are in this legislative meeting, that you just talk about one so that you can focus your energy and their attention on that one thing. And if you want to talk about more problems, if you have, a transportation issue you really care about, and then a healthcare issue you really care about, and you have an issue about, maybe you're super interested in like the medical cannabis program, sure, right? Schedule a separate meeting for each one of those and write out a separate storyboard for each one of those. So as many copies as you want, I will mail them to your house. Like if you want 20 storyboards, you can write 20 stories. I will make them tomorrow and mail them to you. Like you could have as many as you need. But it's important that per storyboard, you just have one problem. The other really important thing to do is to show how that problem affects your life, right? So we could talk all day about how there isn't really transportation in Minnesota. Like we have okay public transportation when you're in the cities, but especially for people with disabilities, it's not always the best. Okay, that's fine. Like that's really high level stuff. What is really, really helpful is for you to talk about what that does to you. So for the transportation example, you could say, I have a really hard time going to get groceries. I live in a food desert and I have to call Metro Mobility to go get groceries, and it takes hours to go to the grocery store. That's a pain, right? That's a personal example that shows how the problem affects your life, right? Not it is a problem, but it is a problem. Here's how it's impacting me. And that's a really good way to share your story and to make sure that the legislator understands that this is impacting real people. The other thing that can be really helpful is sometimes, and I find this less the case with our advocates, and this is more in there because when we do this training with outside groups, it can be really easy to blame and to be like, I hate Metro Mobility. I hate Minnesota Care or whatever. And that's not necessarily always helpful. There's a place for it, right? If it's a system that's really screwing you over, you're allowed to feel those things. But when you're having these meetings, talking about how the system has a problem rather than like, I dislike the system just because, is a much better way to have that conversation. You know, as much as Metro Mobility makes all of us like rip our hair out from stress, it is still a really great program that helps a lot of people get places they otherwise wouldn't be able to go. I think having a more positive thought about it, like, this is a huge problem, but the reason why we're here is so that we fix it, right? We're not here to just like, how many people have had conversations where they just talk to their friend and they complain for like an hour? And you're like, okay, like, I don't know what to do. Like, great, the world is terrible, right? That's not, it doesn't leave you in a good spot, right? And so actually, this is skipping a little bit ahead. That's why the third part is so important, is that solution, right? Because that's saying, okay, here's a problem, but we're gonna be okay because there's a solution to make sure that problem doesn't keep happening, right?
Well, thanks, Mom.
And that actually brings us perfectly into the third section, which is the solution, right? And so this can sometimes be the most daunting part because sometimes it looks a little technical. So if you've seen people testify at hearings before, at the very end, they'll be like, you know, our solution is to support House File 3332, right? And like say a number. I don't want you guys to worry about finding a specific bill. I want you guys to think about what the world would look like if these changes were made. So if I had adequate access to transportation, I could grocery shop when I need and have so much more of my time back. If I had access to medical care that was affordable and accessible, you know, I could get the tests that I need so that I can stay healthy and independent, right? So you don't have to have like a super specific plan. It's more about framing what you want them to do about it. And sometimes there is specifics, you know, sometimes there isn't. But one thing you can do is talk to your lawmaker and ask them to work with you on a solution. Because one of their jobs as a lawmaker is to come up with ideas for bills and pass bills, you know? And so they'll help you brainstorm about these issues, and you just bringing it up can be a really, really great segue into that. You can also just ask, well, I'm going to add this in, this isn't in the slide necessarily, but you can also just ask Jeff, Zach, and I, because a lot of the work that we do is really the solution step, because we look to you to hear about the real life issues that people with brain injury are fixing, because we don't have brain injuries, right? So you guys are our most important intel about what's happening and what problems are. And so we can help work with you to come up with a solution and to get that going in the right direction. And one of the most important things you can do, even if it's just asking them to work with you, is ask them for a commitment. Like, you want to get them to say yes to you. So if you ask them, you know, please support Bill, you know, HF 3332, and they say yes, awesome, success. But it could even be, hey, I'm not quite sure what I'm working on. If I think about, or if I come up with a bill and bring you language, would you be the author? Yes. They might also say no. That's okay. It's okay if you get a no. But you want them to have to answer a question like that. You can ask them, you know, would you be willing to work with me on this? Yes. Right? So you want to put them in a situation where they're answering a question and that they're giving you a commitment to work on this, right? And the solution should also be tied to your problem. So if you have a problem that's like, transportation's a huge issue, your solution shouldn't be like, medical assistance, right? That doesn't track, right? So oftentimes, if you just kind of move from the problem to the solution and describe what it would be like if you didn't have that problem in your life, or if you had a slightly better system to support you, you're good to go. You don't need something super complex and fancy.
Yeah.
Kind of the very last thing when you're done is to say thank you, right? That's really a big thing, because a lot of times these folks are so busy. And you know, even if they don't give you the answer you want, like, you will have meetings where they'll say, no, I can't really support that bill. It happens. It's not because of you. But thank them for their time at the very least.
Yes.
End it on a positive interaction, because you're going to want to schedule a meeting with them down the line, hopefully. So to just really quick wrap us up, you know, and this is on page 13 of your binder, is our highlights are really fourfold. The most important thing is that you're brief, and that you're not taking too long, and that you're keeping their attention. It's also important that you focus on just one issue in that problem, and that if you have multiple, that you split it out into multiple meetings. And then at the very end, when you're wrapping up, the two things that are almost the hardest to remember are to ask for a commitment from them, and then say thank you at the very end. But this is a good cheat sheet before you go into a meeting. Like, oh, what do I need to do? What do I need to do? Okay, I need to be brief. I need to focus on one issue. I need to get a commitment, and I need to say thank you, right? Just a little cheat sheet of the most important stuff. And so the last thing we're going to talk about today before we move into working in small groups is what does COVID do to all of this? And really the good thing is that the fundamental way that we tell stories and that we connect with lawmakers is not changed, because we still prioritize you guys telling your story to them. And you know, with technology, with phones, there are a lot of different avenues for you to still do that. And so us going in person isn't the end all be all of being good advocates. You can be a great advocate from home. And I think we've actually been able to learn from some of our amazing rural advocates about how important that kind of advocacy is. You know, so, you know, a lot of things at the Capitol have changed. And so this is actually an opportunity to reach out to lawmakers who are working at the legislature longer than they normally would, right? So they're kind of back and forth all summer. That means they're checking their emails all summer. So it's a really, really good opportunity to send an email or make a phone call. There are a lot of online town hall forums that are happening. Most of the time those are offered over Zoom, so in the exact same format as this. And that's a great place to share your story and to hear what they're working on. And finally, and Jeff is going to talk about this a little bit at the end, is, you know, this is an election year. There's a lot of stuff happening. So make sure you're registered to vote, make sure you vote, stay engaged with elections, watch for what's happening. So there are so many ways that even with COVID and even with being at home, you can still be an amazing advocate and you can still have a really big impact.